Good evening. My name is Oluwaseyi Falaye. The topic before me today is lack of information, the real culprits in documentation debts. Please come along. Abstract. This presentation is a more detailed look at lack of information and its contribution to documentation debts. It's inspired by the paper investigating the link between user stories and documentation debts on software projects. It looks at ways a lack of information contributes to documentation debts and resultant effects that lack of information has on software development projects. The finding of this project, of this presentation, I beg your pardon, rather, is not limited to the findings on the paper. I have taken a look at other journals, I've taken a look at other publications here and there, and I've come up with my own research and conclusion as well as to how lack of information is greatly responsible for documentation debts. Table of content, we're going to look at documentation debts, what that is. We're going to look at the problem, documentation debts. We're going to look at lack of information and connect both of them. After that, we're going to take a look at the forms of lack of information, the causes, solution, and then we end with our conclusion. Documentation debts. What exactly is documentation debts? Technical debts, also known as design debts or code debts, but can also, of course, relate to other non-technical endeavors, is a concept in software development that reflects the implied cost of additional reward cost by choosing an easy or limited solution now, instead of using a better approach that would take longer. Sometimes this happens because, of course, we're trying to minimize cost, or we just think, oh, it's a small project, it's too big of is an overkill to do certain things. And then we decide to take the shortcuts, or we decide to go through the back door rather than do things the way they are meant to be. Now, I need to point out at this structure that sometimes this is not technical debt isn't incurred willingly. Sometimes it's done ignorantly because we're not aware that we're omitting or that we're making the right decision. So technical debt includes internal development tasks that you choose not to perform, but run the risk of causing further problems if not completed. Like I said, sometimes we do not choose to do it. It just actually happens because we don't know better or because we're ignorant of it. Documentation debt further. It is common for teams to take shortcuts during software development that in future will lead to maintainability issues and affect productivity and development costs. Different types of document debts may affect software projects, including those associated with software documentation. Although there are many studies on document debts, few focus on documentation debts in an industrial environment. So one of the reasons why I really wanted to take a look at this topic. Different types of technical debt can occur throughout the phase of software development process. One of them is documentation debts. Documentation debt refers to issues encountered during software project documentation that can be identified by locating inadequate, missing, or incomplete artifacts. This is normally typically be picked up later in development stage. Maybe the developers or the group programmers are about to, implement a feature, and then all of a sudden discover that there isn't detailed information about how the feature should be implemented, who should use the feature, when does the feature start, who activates it, who is responsible for it, and all of that. The increase of the amount of complexity of documentation over time contributes to higher debt interests, making the effort to pay off the debts even more difficult. So what happens is, if a lack of information or if a missing piece of information isn't provided or discovered, it will definitely cascade down to the other further features or processes that need to occur after that particular one. So the effect of it is actually multiplied. It's like a building with faulty foundations. Once the foundation is faulty, definitely the building structure itself has been compromised from the beginning. The problem. Defects detected later in the development cycle are far more difficult to manage and deal with. This is a known fact, of course. The farther into the project a problem is discovered, the more expensive it is for that particular, project, the farther it is more difficult for it to be solved. According to the paper, cost and benefits of early defects detection, experiences from developing client server and host application. Based on data, dependencies between the cost of early detection, late defect detection, and defect fixing are analyzed, and some guidelines are derived from timing and resources allocation to ensure cost-effective defect detection. Essentially, the report states or report points out to the fact that the later into the development cycle or the development process a defect is discovered, then the more difficult. So usually it's a case of penny wise found foolish. This is obviously an issue that cannot be ignored. Firstly, because of the peculiar time that we are in the world and the demand for software development projects to be cost effective and manageable within reasonable and available limited budgets. We know that we are in a peculiar time because of the pandemic more than ever before. The economy has been affected and software development projects are required to now be cost effective. And therefore we cannot afford to just throw in money that isn't even available. To tackle this problem, we have to deal with it from the roots. Lack of information. In plain, simple English, lack of information refers to the voluntary or involuntary omission of required knowledge and application helpful to achieve a certain goal, a certain result. In this case, the particular software developments that we are currently embarking on. The need or importance of information. We all know the need for and importance of information. Typically, stakeholders, developers, business analysts, managers require the right level of information to be able to deliver an adequate product, to be able to deliver a product that meets the need. Information is a bedrock of all corporate and individual innovations. Information is an aid in decision-making, policy-making, needed for the policymakers, decision-makers, managers, etc. Information will have a reinforcing, a transforming effect on human beings who are receiving it. Information generates new information. So as we go on the project or in the discovery stages of the project, we find out that as information comes, there's a need for more information, and there's a need and for more drilling down information here and there. The problem is if the required base knowledge or information is unavailable, then it is impossible to get detailed. This would definitely affect the software documentation when and during it's being done. The connection, according to the paper investigating the link between user stories and documentation depth in software projects, it was found out that lack of information contributed greatly to documentation depth. In the paper, a series of methodologies were used to complement. Two complementary studies were performed independently. First was a literature review, and the second was an exploratory study aimed to characterize the difficulties in the use of user stories when compared to the traditional approach. Findings of both methodologies were similar. In the literature review conducted, 19 papers were selected. Lack of information was considered to be one of the problems, in fact, the major problem in working with agile requirements. In the second methodology, however, it was observed that lack of information was mentioned by 8 of 10 participants in the study. Now consider this figure below. We see that lack of information was mentioned by 8 and has the highest ratio in all the other reasons that were discussed. In fact, the second to it is exactly half of it. So it's obvious that this is a problem that we can't ignore. It's obvious that of all things to worry about and care about and be concerned about in terms of the causes of documentation deaths, lack of information stands out. This cannot be ignored. And this is why I personally chose this particular topic to further drill and further make some expositions about it. How the problem crystallizes. Unlike traditional methods, agile methodologies usually employ short iterative cycles and rely on tactic knowledge within a team. In particular, agile requirements, e.g. user stories, tend to reduce the focus on requirement specification activities. This scenario contributes to the occurrence of documentation debts. This set of exercises can result in missing information or omission of vital knowledge for the implementation of the project. Forms of lack of information. Lack of information can manifest itself in different forms. There's still a lot of research that can be done further, but for the purpose of this presentation, we look at a few forms of lack of information. Lack of information can show itself in the form of omissions, generally omissions in the document, and it could be as a result of, improper stakeholder selection, or the person wasn't available, and therefore when the software ASEROS documentation was being developed, that he wasn't aware or he wasn't there available to provide the knowledge or to make an observation that provided more information through the discovery stage. It can also occur by procrastination. Sometimes we can do that later. Let's get the important features, only to find out later in the future that because we ignore that particular feature, we ignore that particular phase, we also omitted a lot of information that was required for the application to be able to run smoothly. And of course, we can be ignorant. We just don't know that there's an information that is required that we're missing. So causes of information can be wrong stakeholder composition. We don't have the right people attending. We don't have the right people part of the project. It could be as a result of poor elicitation. Elicitation is one of the most important parts of software development process or requirements engineering. If this is wrong, it can lead to lack of information. Of course, prioritization and costs, where we're trying to prioritize and then we don't, and we're concerned about costs, and then we don't have the required technical resources because they are too expensive. And of course, policies can also affect that. Stakeholders, the requirement definition process begins with the elicitation of stakeholders' requirements. The first step is to identify the stakeholders from whom those requirements are to be gathered. Like I said, if we do not identify the right stakeholders and make them a part of the team, there will be a lot of missing information that would affect the documentation process. Of course, cost and prioritization. Cost is always a factor. We're trying to cut costs. We are limited in our resources and all of that. Elicitation, wrong elicitation, not asking the right questions, not engaging properly, or the presence of bias in elicitation, where people are omitting information, whether to sabotage the development process or for some other reason. And of course, governments and policies, where policies keep changing every now and then. The solution: to solve this problem, we need to ensure that elicitation is done and is done correctly, adequately, the right way, right questions are asked, the right stakeholders are engaged. Inspection as well, we can ensure that as software SRS is done and included as part of the development process. A lot of companies, a lot of organizations do not do this. We need to get adequate feedback. We also need to be systematic about our stakeholder selection. And of course, we cannot really do anything about policies and how politics affects software development, but we can put in place change management processes that ensure that once the change is discovered, is raised, we can adequately fit it and have a well-defined change management process for which we can. So elicitation, invest more time and efforts in elicitation stage, ask probing questions, ensure that there are no biases in interview responses, do not rush elicitation phase in requirements engineering, ensure all aspects of projects are adequately represented, ensure feedback from stakeholders, ensure multiple workshop forums with stakeholders, speak with the core business units, SRS inspection, ensure well-constituted team of reviewers, enforce the traditional maker-checker rule. An author cannot be a reader at the same time, combined to a more defect detection methods. I strongly encourage the checklists method. In my conclusion, SRS inspection is a good way to ensure that lack of information does not plague requirements engineering specification. There's a lot of work that has to be done in this area. It's encouraged that a lot of investment should go into SRS inspection stage. However, the wrong selection of stakeholders will easily result into document debt or documentation debt through lack of information. Required engineering process should be followed as best as possible to eradicate any appearance of document debt through lack of information. Thank you, and here are my references.